Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Brandon Lewis is the Tory chairman charged with revitalising his party, but this weekend Tory morale is inextricably linked with the fate of Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, over the treatment of the Windrush generation and a memo about targets for compulsory deportations, which she ought to have seen. And Brandon Lewis was her immigration minister before he got his current job. He was the man, apparently, to whom the memo was sent. So can I ask you, first of all, Brandon Lewis, did you get that memo?
Yes, absolutely. It was a memo to me.
And do you remember reading it?
Yes, I do, actually, yes. And one of the key things I think we need to remember with this memo, I think it was dated about the 4th of July. It was in my first week or two in that particular role, which I had for about 6 months. And it was a memo to me from the immigration enforcement team outlining what the team had been doing, what they'd been doing and their achievements in the previous year, with a bit of a forward look to what they thought they could be doing in the year ahead.
We've been doing very well. We're ahead of targets on these deportation figures.
Well, they were saying, actually, generally what they were doing, and as I say, outlining their results from the previous year, bearing in mind, of course, that one of the things I think the government quite rightly has been focused on, I have to say, as Immigration Minister, I was equally focused on, was increasing the number of illegal immigrants that are in this country that we want to remove. I think the British public want to know that the government is focused, because we have to remember with some of this, with the illegal immigration, we have got people there, we've got criminals exploiting some of the most vulnerable people in the world through modern slavery, rogue landlords who are exploiting people in terms of how they live, but also foreign national offenders. That's criminals who are currently here at the taxpayers' expense. And I think people want to see the government deal with that. We were focused on that, and that's what they were outlining.
So you would target, this is, from your point of view, a policy to be celebrated, not hidden away from. Were you surprised when the Home Secretary told the Commons that she didn't know about any deportation figures?
Well, I think, actually, you've got to bear in mind what she was saying on Wednesday. There are two different things going on here, and I know the opposition like to conflate these things, but Andrew, let me just be very clear. What that report and that memo to me was that was a briefing memo, effectively to me, was outlining the figures from the previous year, and the team outlining to me that in the context of wanting to see that 10% increase in removals of illegal migrants and foreign national offenders, that what they thought they could, which was over a period of time, and we were putting 10 million, Home Secretary had allocated another 10 million to that.
And that is a target, clearly.
To look at having that ambition to see another 10% increase in the years ahead. And the immigration enforcement team outlining what they thought was achievable in the next year, based on what they'd achieved the previous year.
So when she told Parliament, we don't have targets for removals, that wasn't true. And when she said, if you're asking me, are there numbers of people we expect to be removed, that is not how we operate. That is exactly how you operate, isn't it?
Well, actually,
you just told us
well, again, you've given a quote from what Amber said, and she was right in what she said. If you look at the question, hold on, Andrew, if you look at the question she was asked, she was being asked about the localised, regional, internal, effectively the KPIs the Immigration Enforcement Agency was using. And no, she was not aware of that. She's clear about that. I've worked with Amber. I don't know how focused she is on getting things right. And I think she's also correct. Now she's aware of that, to say that's not the right way to deal with something when we're dealing with serious organised crime that works on a national basis.
So you had these figures. You knew about the memo. You were, according to the National Audit Office, chairing weekly meetings, proceeding on progress, looking at how the numbers are going. Did you discuss any of this with Amber Rudd as Immigration Minister?
Well, again, Andrew, I think there's two different things. First of all, the memo did not talk about those internal targets that the Immigration Enforcement team had that was referred to at the Home Affairs Select Committee. No, it didn't. I had the memo, Andrew, and what the memo outlines is the overall figure of the achievement they'd had in the previous year. Now, I was working through on a weekly basis to make sure that we were doing everything we could, working with the police, working with local government, and making sure that we were doing what we could to help vulnerable people, to crack down on criminals, and to remove more people who are here illegally. And yes, I did talk to the Home Secretary about that and the overall work we were doing and the overall ambition to see an increase in numbers, but not on the detailed
targets. Well, she knew there were targets, therefore. If you had talked to her, she must have known there were targets.
Now, what the Home Secretary was very aware of was her ambition to see an increase in the number of people who were being here illegally, that we were removing, particularly those foreign national offenders.
And she'd put,
but those internal targets were not in the those internal targets were not in the memo and not figures that she was aware of.
But she had put 10 million quid in to get a 10% increase in deportations. If that is not a target, what is it?
Well, actually, what the Home Secretary had done, having allocated a further £10 million to that team, was said to the team, what can we seek, what will the impact of that be? And that 10% is an ambition based on what we believe was the impact of the increase we could see in terms of the people we were removing. And it is absolutely right.
So the defence of the Home Secretary is an ambition, not a target?
Well, actually, there's a big difference between the two things, because what the Home Secretary wanted to do was make sure we were spending taxpayers' money to do the right thing by some of the most vulnerable people in the world, and to crack down on the criminals who are otherwise here at the British taxpayers' expense. And that is not acceptable.
This is a target. I mean, again, going back to the original memo, they said progress has been made on a path towards the 10% increased performance on enforced returns, which we promised the Home Secretary earlier this year. That is a target promised to the Home Secretary.
Absolutely, but that is different to what she was talking about on Wednesday. Well, on Wednesday, she was talking about the Home Affairs Select Committee was talking about the internal KPIs that immigration enforcement team had that she was not aware of. That's different to the overarching ambition and aim that she had to see an increase of 10% overall in the returns of illegal immigrants. And she's right to do that. We as a government need to be clear about that's the right thing to do.
She was asked, are there deportation targets? She said, I'm against deportation targets, and no, there aren't. And she was wrong on both of those things. There are deportation targets, we've just been discussing them, and she knew about them.
But again, Andrew, you're falling into the trap that some people put out there. You're conflating two different things. The discussion at the Home Affairs Select Committee, I think if you look back at the detail, was about those internal, regional, localised targets that the Home Secretary has taken the view is not the way to do it, and she's right to do that. But the overall target, that 10% increase we want to see, is right. They were just asking about
targets. This is a very, very, very sort of thin line to defend.
No, they were talking about information they had and previous evidence they had got, which was around the internal workings of the Immigration Enforcement Agency. That's a different thing to looking to make sure that we're doing everything we can to remove people from the country who are here illegally.
I'm just reading her own words to Parliament. We don't have targets for removals, she said. Whatever the question she was asked, she said, we don't have targets for removals. You did have targets for removals. If you're asking me, are there numbers of people we expect to be removed, that is not how we operate. That is how they operate. She knew about it at the time, by your own admission.
Well, also, Andrew, you have to bear in mind, although having put £10 million into this team to make sure that we were achieving more in terms of returning people who are here illegally, we do not have, and the Home Secretary, no ministers, or even the Immigration Enforcement Agency, don't have full control of the issues that affect the number of people that can be returned. Quite often the courts will take a view about a country you can't return to. I myself went to India to negotiate, which we managed to agree in January, a new agreement to be able to do enforced returns to India. All of these factors. So you can't have, and that's why it's right, the Home Secretary never had a view about a set figure. It was about seeing that overall aim of an increase in the number of returns that we had.
But she may not have known all the detail, but she certainly knew there were targets, and she told the House of Commons there weren't targets, and she certainly knew that this was a system for increasing the number of deportations, a system she now says she doesn't agree with.
Well, what was at the Home Affairs Select Committee, as I say, was they were talking about, and this was in response to questions about those internal KPI targets the Immigration Enforcement had. Home Secretary herself is going to make a statement. It's right that she does that to Parliament first tomorrow, where she will explain the details behind this, but that is different. The overarching aim she had to see, quite rightly, that work going forward to remove people who are in the country illegally.
You were chairing these weekly meetings. Did she ever attend any of these weekly meetings?
No, these were meetings that I chaired. They were internal meetings with the team that I would do. And I would talk to the Home Secretary about the work we were doing and the success we were having.
You'd keep her in touch with what was going on in those meetings?
In the overarching work, because actually it was outlined to her.
She copied into memos from those meetings?
Well, I didn't memo her on the meetings, no, because we were having them weekly. So I would talk to her about what we were discussing in those meetings. The fact that we were working with the police to crack down on the serious and organised crime that exploits people, working with local government to talk to them about the work to crack down on road
vandals. She knew all about all of this.
And she knew about that work, and she was very supportive of that. And actually, that's the work that the Home Office rightly continues to do.
And did you send her minutes of these meetings?
No, not that I recall, but obviously I don't know what went in her box. What I do know is if Amber Rudd says she didn't see that memo, and I'm confident that she didn't have that memo, when Amber Rudd says she didn't see something, I know she didn't see it.
But you were talking to her about what was going on?
Absolutely, talking to her about the general work we were doing to increase the focus we had and to increase the number of returns of illegal immigrants. That's something that's beneficial to the whole of the country, because immigration, illegal immigration, is bad for our economy and it's bad for the vulnerable people who are exploited as a result of it. And Amber was always hugely focused on making sure we were doing the right thing and continue to do the right thing by some of the most vulnerable people in the world. That's why she's such a good Home Secretary. She may be a very good Home Secretary, but that also seems to me to be inconsistent with what she told the House of Commons. And that will be the issue tomorrow, I'm quite sure. Can I ask you about going forward? There's been some reports in the papers today that on the table in the EU negotiations is the possibility of other EU nationals, nationals from other countries coming to this country with preferential status after we leave the EU, better status in terms of going for British jobs, access to the NHS, access to social security and so forth. Is that on the table? Well, we've already got the agreement with Europe in December, the agreement we had there for EU citizens who are in the country already, roughly 3.5 million EU citizens to get settled status. Obviously, we're now in the negotiations about what happens through the implementation period and moving on to the negotiation about the final stages. I'm not going to prejudge what David Davis and the Prime Minister will be able to negotiate. No, but the question is really going ahead whether EU citizens have access to this country on preferential status or preferential background. Well, EU citizens who are in this country already will have the ability to get settled status. And people who come, as we've already outlined, EU citizens who come here in the implementation period with the ability. There'll be a slightly different system, which they'll have to register, but the ability to go forwards for settled status. The situation after the implementation period hasn't been decided yet. All right. Can I ask you a very straightforward question? If we stay in the customs union, is that delivering Brexit or not? Well, the Prime Minister has been very clear. We won't be staying in the customs union. The country voted in the referendum. We're going to deliver on that, and we will be coming out of the customs union. What's a customs partnership? Well, it's different. A customs partnership is an agreement with the European Union about being able to trade with as little frictionless and easy, efficient borders so we can continue really good trade. But importantly, giving us the ability to work those trade agreements around the world where there's so much opportunity for the British economy. And this customs partnership would involve us taking some of the tariffs for the EU, taking EU tariffs and passing them on? Well, actually, I think this is where we've got to be very clear. There's a big difference. If there's the argument that Vince Cable and others will put, if we were to stay in the customs union, when we've left the European Union, we'd have less say and less power over what's happened. Partnership, well, I'm just explaining that, Andrew. Less say and less power over the tariffs that are put on us, because we won't be part of the decision-making process. It will be put upon us. That's why it's absolutely right that we leave the customs union, as the Prime Minister has said. In a partnership, that means we're negotiating the agreements we have as we go forward, and that's what will be part of those negotiations about that final end state after the implementation period. So why does Jacob Rees-Mogg call the partnership cretinous? Well, none of us have yet seen the final decision. Jacob has his own wonderful way with words to explain things. I think it's important that we are able to get the opportunities of trade deals around the world, good trade deals with our partners and friends in Europe, and that's what a good partnership will deliver. And I believe that's what the Prime Minister and David Davis will deliver for this country. A sort of parallel question to the one I asked Andrew Gwynn. Do you worry that the Windrush controversy is going to affect the results of the local elections from your point of view? Well, the experience I've had, I've been all over the country over the last few weeks. We've got elections all over the country. It's people on the doorsteps talking about the issues that matter to them locally, and that's what they're focused on. Whether it's in Birmingham, that they're frustrated with Labour not even collecting the rubbish, whether it's in Manchester, where they're frustrated that Conservative councils are cheaper for their council tax and still investing in good frontline services. It's the issues that matter locally. And in Sutton, just last week, a Liberal Democrat area, absolute frustration on literally every doorstep with the most ridiculous bin collection scheme that needs to be simplified, and local council votes can do that. So a good night for the Tories, a bad night for the Tories. Where should we be looking? Well, we've seen Labour. It was interesting to see Andrew just now moving back from their original predictions of turning the whole of London red. But we've got elections all over the country, and we're working hard to make sure we get good councillors elected in every part of the country. OK, just coming back to my first line of question, can you say categorically that you have never been in a room with Amber Rudd talking about deportation targets? I've been in a room with Amber Rudd talking about increasing the number of returns, but Amber Rudd and I never discussed particular numbers in the way that was outlined at the Home Affairs Select Committee. Brandon Lewis, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
First this morning, Brandon Lewis, who was Immigration Minister until last year and who's now Conservative Party Chairman, has said he did see the memo produced last summer confirming the Home Office had removal targets for illegal immigrants. The Home Secretary told MPs on Wednesday she wasn't aware of targets, and when the memo that she was copied into leaked on Friday, she said she hadn't seen it. Amber Rudd's due to make a statement to the Commons tomorrow, and she might have been hoping to draw a line under this story. It's been Groundhog Day all week in Westminster. Every morning, the Prime Minister and the Labour leader have been waking up to be confronted by the same problems that simply won't go away.
The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans.
The looming hulk of the Empire Windrush has become a symbol of the Prime Minister's own policies coming back to haunt her, and evidence to some of continuing institutional racism.
Just ask the Windrush generation.
The Home Secretary denied the existence of targets for deportation to a select committee of MPs.
We don't have targets for removals.
But then the next day, this.
The immigration arm of the Home Office has been using local targets for internal performance management.
While an embattled Theresa May was left fending off questions over her own role.
They are not illegal. They are here legally.
As calls for the Home Secretary's resignation grew, the bookies were already shortening the odds on her demise. Could an amnesty for illegal immigrants help solve the government's woes? Boris Johnson thought so, an idea he raised with the PM at Cabinet. His colleagues were less enthusiastic.
It would be wrong, it would encourage other people to think that they can come here illegally.
There was to be no weekend respite for Ms Rudd. As The Guardian revealed, a memo was sent to the Secretary of State just last summer, specifically referring to targets. Now she was accused of misleading the House of Commons twice. But in a series of tweets, the Home Secretary apologised, admitting she was ignorant, but hadn't lied. For Jeremy Corbyn, the oldest prejudice was turning into the Labour Party's never-ending problem.
Thank you very much.
Labour activist Mark Wadsworth faced trial by subcommittee as a Jewish MP arrived to give evidence in the face of protests.
Mark Wadsworth.
Wadsworth was expelled, but Unite leader Len McCluskey stirred the pot by claiming anti-Semitism was a smear being used by some Labour MPs to toxify the party. Mr Corbyn's most loyal defenders were quick to pile in.
Millions of Labour supporters are exasperated and angry about the shenanigans of a handful of Labour MPs.
But did his leader agree with Mr McCluskey?
No, because I think we have to deal with the issue of anti-Semitism.
It's enough to make anyone, including Jeremy and Theresa, pray for a swift return to normality. Brexit, anyone? Now, before we talk to the panel about all the stories of the week, it's worth just listening to what Brandon Lewis, he's the Tory party chairman, but was Immigration Minister until January this year, what he told my colleague Andrew Marr this morning about what Amber Rudd knew about those removal targets for illegal immigrants.
This is a target. I mean, again, going back to the original memo, they said progress has been made on a path towards the 10% increased performance on enforced returns, which we promised the Home Secretary earlier this year. That is a target promised to the Home Secretary.
Absolutely, but that is different to what she was talking about on Wednesday. Well, on Wednesday, she was talking about the Home Affairs Select Committee was talking about the internal KPIs that immigration enforcement team had that she was not aware of. That's different to the overarching ambition and aim that she had to see an increase of 10% overall in the returns of illegal immigrants. And she's right to do that. We as a government need to be clear about that's the right thing to do.
And here's a clip of the Home Affairs Select Committee appearance by Amber Rudd that Brandon Lewis was referring to there. Was Ms Rudd saying that there were no removal targets at all, or was she answering a specific question about key performance indicators, as Mr Lewis just claimed?
And targets for removals, when were they set? We don't have targets for removals. But you did? I don't know what are you referring to?
We've just heard from the previous evidence that the Home Office and there are regional targets for net removals.
I didn't hear the testimony. I'm not sure what shape that might be in. But if you're asking me are the numbers of people we expect to be removed, that's not how we operate.
So this is a story that has been running all week, and Brandon Lewis's intervention has certainly raised the temperature. Gabby, has he helped Amber Rudd this morning? Presumably that was his intention, to come on the television and get her out of this hole about whether or not she knew about removal targets. And has it been helpful?
It's a hell of a hole to try and get someone out of, in fairness to Brandon Lewis. I mean, he is dancing on the head of the smallest pin in history, and there's only so adroitly you can do that. We're now sort of bogged down in a sort of, no doubt confusing to most people, argument about which of the various targets that she knew existed she might have been talking about when she said one didn't exist. And I think we're getting to the point, we know tomorrow in Parliament she's going to have to make another statement, which is going to be another apology, what, the fifth, sixth apology. You know, if there's a day with a Y in it, Amber Rudd is apologising for something. And you just get to a point where it almost becomes unfeasible to carry on being tripped up by answers that you've given that are then contraindicated by something else.
Yeah, because let's look at some of the things that she said. We heard the Select Committee evidence. She also tweeted, "I wasn't aware of specific removal targets. I should have been." And she said, when she came to the Commons after the Select Committee appearance, "I've never agreed there should be specific removal targets." Is that contradicted by what Brandon Lewis was saying this morning, Rachel?
I think this is desperate, weaselly stuff from Brandon Lewis today. Look, if she did know, that's bad. If she didn't know, that's bad. In either way, she has to go. And let's not forget, it's not just about the targets. It's about the fact that her department was responsible for causing misery, desperate misery to people, deporting them, creating a situation in which they would lose their jobs, lose their homes, lose access to healthcare. That alone is enough. That is enough for a Home Secretary to resign, having caused this much anguish to so many British citizens. And let's not forget also that this hostile environment was created by Theresa May. She was the one whose odious nativism underpinned, created the operational premises for a system that, by definition, was going to catch people like the Windrush generation in its punitive and suspecting net. But
it's not just this government who have wanted to say that they were cracking down specifically on illegal immigration. I mean, Tony Blair used to boast about setting targets for this. Ed Miliband had it carved in stone that they were going to cut immigration. I mean, Ian Dale, how have we got to a position where the Home Secretary is saying she wasn't aware of any specific removal targets and possibly is in trouble about that when the government used to be proud of having removal targets?
Well, she says she didn't see the memo that she was copied into, and from her point of view, I suppose that's quite crucial. The memo wasn't sent to her directly, it was sent to Brandon Lewis, but copied to her office. Now, I imagine
but what Brandon Lewis seemed to be saying this morning was, quite aside from that very specific memo, that there was a general target to up removals by 10% and that the Home Secretary was aware of that.
Well, on the face of it, if she wasn't aware of it, she should have been aware of it. I'm quite clear about that. And tomorrow is going to be a very big day for Amber Rudd because it is death by 1,000 cuts at the moment. And we've seen this before. If you remember back in the Blair government when David Blunkett resigned, when Charles Clarke resigned, it was a very similar pattern. Sort of day after day there were fresh revelations, and some of them weren't even related to the first one. And there's no doubt about it that Amber Rudd made a big mistake by effectively blaming her civil servants for the Windrush debacle. And whatever the truth of that was, if you blame your civil servants, don't be surprised if they then leak against you. And I think if there are one or two more leaks against her over this week, she's going to be in a very difficult situation. Having said that, no one in government wants her to go. The Prime Minister certainly doesn't want her to go because at the moment she's effectively being a bit of a human shield.
Yeah, well, we're going to come back and talk to all of you throughout the programme. Right now we're joined by from Sheffield by the Shadow Home Office Minister Louise Haigh. Thank you very much for joining us. What's your view on Amber Rudd's position? Ought she to resign over this?
Well, absolutely. And I watched Brandon Lewis's interview this morning on Andrew Marr with interest, and he absolutely confirmed that the Home Secretary was aware of targets, in fact that she'd put £10 million extra into that team in order for them to meet those targets. He then tried to obfuscate the issue and say that it wasn't exactly the target she was talking about to the Home Affairs Select Committee, but that clip that you just played made very clear that she was telling Parliament this week that there were no targets at all. Brandon Lewis effectively confirmed this morning that she deliberately misled Parliament, so with that alone she has to go. But beyond that, her whole response to the Windrush scandal has basically been to say, I didn't know anything about it, I'm sorry. Well, if your only excuse is gross incompetence, then you cannot remain in post. And I think people will be watching across the country thinking, if this happened in my job, if I messed up on this scale and could only say, sorry, Gov, I didn't know, then of course I'd lose my job. So absolutely, if tomorrow she doesn't offer her resignation, then we know exactly why. It's because these policies lead directly back to the Prime Minister, and if the Prime Minister forces Amber Rudd to resign, then it will leave her incredibly exposed.
The politics of this is interesting. The former Labour Home Secretary, David Blunkett, has been saying that he doesn't want to see Amber Rudd resign because he thinks that she's a Remain voice within the Cabinet, articulating policies that are closer to Labour policy, and she's seen as being quite liberal in immigration, probably more so than anybody who might replace her. So is it really in your interests to call for her job?
I know Amber Rudd has this reputation of being a liberal Remainer type, but I saw her speech that she gave to Conservative Party conference just after being made Home Secretary, where she demanded that companies would have to report on the numbers of immigrants that they employ. I've seen the approach that she's taken to the police over the last couple of years that she's been Home Secretary. So I would completely disagree that we have much in agreement with Amber Rudd. I shadow her on a daily basis, and I find very little that I can agree with her on. You know, it's important.
So would an incoming Labour government have targets for removing people who are here illegally?
We would make sure that we had a fair and managed migration system. I don't think targets of this nature work, and the Home Office has received repeated warnings that people that are here legally but without documentation would be caught up in a target like this. Nobody would disagree with the Home Office attempting to remove illegal immigrants, and particularly immigrants that are foreign national offenders. But I think what the public's frustration is that they routinely see examples in the media, and I've got an example that I'm pursuing at the moment, of people that are here illegally, that are serious, repeat offenders, and the Home Office are failing to remove them, yet they're going after people that have lived here decades, that are here completely legally.
So exactly these people who you do want to be removed are more likely to be so, surely, if a Labour government does set a target for that.
Targets drive behaviour, so it's important that we have measurements and that we have targets of certain descriptions, but not just generic targets about deportations, which have swept up these people that are here completely legally and that don't have documentation. And the Home Office was warned about this in 2014. There's another memo that's been leaked that said low-hanging fruit, like people that were here completely legally, like the Windrush generation, that are British citizens, would be targeted for deportation. Now, the reason Theresa May can't sack Amber Rudd is because that memo exposes that she probably knew about the targets as well. So as well as Amber Rudd facing Parliament tomorrow, the Prime Minister should be there answering serious questions on this as well.
Now, the other big running story of the week, of course, has been the Labour Party's problems with anti-Semitism. Len McCluskey, the leader of the Unite Union, a big backer of Jeremy Corbyn, big funder of the Labour Party, has accused some Labour MPs of using anti-Semitism as a way to smear Jeremy Corbyn, to demean, attack and toxify the party. Do you agree with him?
No. And actually, if you read Len's article, he did say that he accepted that anti-Semitism exists in the Labour Party, and that it wasn't just it wasn't a problem to raise it, but quite the opposite, that anybody that sees it should raise it. Any form of racism. But he also said that
certain Labour MPs were deliberately using this to attack the reputation of the leader and bringing the party into disrepute as a result.
No, I completely disagree with that, and as does Jeremy. He said repeatedly that that raising anti-Semitism is not a smear against Jeremy Corbyn or the Labour Party. It's absolutely vital that wherever any form of racism and anti-Semitism is clearly a pernicious form of racism, wherever it's seen, it should be reported and it should be acted upon swiftly by the Labour Party.
So, I mean, what Len McCluskey is saying is that Jeremy Corbyn's critics talking about anti-Semitism should shut up. Are you saying it's actually Len McCluskey who should be keeping his mouth shut on this?
I completely disagree with Len on this.
All right, well, Louis Haig, that's very clear. Thank you very much for joining us.
Delighted to be joined by the Transport and London Minister, Jo Johnson. Lovely to have you here.
Morning.
Now, we just heard the former Immigration Minister, Brandon Lewis, say on the BBC that he was aware of these targets to reduce the number of illegal immigrants in this country. Amber Rudd was Home Secretary at the time. How could her deputy have been aware of the targets? And she says she wasn't aware.
Well, as Amber has herself explained, her office is copied in on many documents that circulate around the Home Office, and this, I understand, was one that went to Brandon in his capacity as Immigration Minister. She did not see it and was not aware.
Well, it went to her office,
and was not aware
so we know
of
it
those
went to her
targets.
office. She's admitted it went to her office. I mean, it doesn't say much for her ability to do her job if she doesn't read important documents.
No, Amber is a very competent Secretary of State. She's a great Home Secretary, and I want her to continue in that role, to continue to deliver on the important changes which she's putting in place. I think she's an outstanding figure in our politics, and like Ed, I'm a big, big fan of hers, and I think she's got a massive amount to contribute at the very highest levels of government in years ahead.
Within the Home Office, what policy is as important as reducing the numbers of illegal immigrants here?
Well, Amber's got a very, very big remit in the Home Office. It spans a whole suite of policy areas, including, of course, policing and crime. And one of the things that's impressed me about what she's done in recent months, for example, is to roll out a very ambitious serious violence strategy, which she published a couple of weeks ago.
But can I just ask you, but I want to know, is it excusable that she didn't know the targets?
Look, Amber's got a very, very big area of responsibility. She's also sitting on a whole host of cabinet committees delivering on other areas of vital government policy, including on how we make a success of Brexit so that it works for all people in this country. It's unrealistic to expect a Secretary of State to have seen every single memo that covers all of the policy areas.
It's perfectly reasonable for any minister to not know about a central element of their department's policy.
I think she has rightly delegated significant responsibility within her departments to her junior ministers, who include Brandon Lewis. He's a very capable minister in his own right. That system of delegation is quite common in our system of government, and it's unrealistic to expect every Home Secretary to see every document that passes through an email account.
Some people would say that the only reason she is still in her post is because if she goes, the attention will focus on her boss, the Prime Minister, who, of course, set the policy on immigration, which is seen as underlying this shockingly poor treatment of the Windrush generation.
Look, both the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister have apologised on many occasions now for the appalling treatment of the Windrush generation. The Home Secretary has set out plans to put that right, and I think the right thing to do now is to give Amber space to get on and to deliver the changes that are going to see the Windrush generation and others who've been put in that position given the chance to get that right. So that means getting the citizenship status to which they're entitled, making sure they don't have to pay fees, pass language tests, whatever, and also, in due course, get the appropriate compensation that they deserve for the treatment that they've experienced. And I think Amber is the right person to make sure that all of that is put right.
Now, in your area, huge public discontent with the way that our railways are run. Only a couple of days ago, the people who run the Thameslink line said publicly about some changes to the way that the Thameslink will operate. When criticised because they're reducing the number of commuter trains, well, it's all right. If you can't get on the train, you can drive in. That was a shocking thing to say, wasn't it?
Look, Thameslink is an example of massive investment by the government in our transport system. It's a £7 billion programme that is going to significantly increase capacity on our system. Look, we're dealing with...
But if you live in Harpenden, for example, something like the capacity serving those commuters will reduce by a third. That doesn't sound like investment. That sounds like disinvestment.
We're dealing with the challenges of a congested network that has suffered from decades of underinvestment. We are now investing more in our railways than at any time since the Victorian era to ensure that there's extra capacity, better rolling stock, newer rolling stock, better quality signalling, so more trains can run on what is a busy and congested system.
Is it reasonable for a franchise chief executive to say, if you can't get on the train, drive in? Is that an acceptable statement?
Well, look, of course, we do hold train operating companies carefully to account for performance as part of their franchise ownership. It's absolutely vital that we do so.
This is the company that also runs Southern, which was, has also been a dog's breakfast in terms of performance. Why do they still hold the franchises?
Indeed, Southern's performance, you will have seen, has been improving over recent months. It obviously suffered badly during the industrial action that we saw by the RMT last year. It is now starting to improve quite significantly, and we want to see that.
Do you have confidence in the franchise system? The Public Accounts Committee last week said it thought that effectively the franchise system had failed. Do you have confidence in the system?
Look, the franchise system has worked very, very well over its period. Look, we have, don't forget, seen a doubling of the number of passengers using our railway system over the past period of time since privatisation, since the early 1990s. We're dealing now with the challenges that arise when you've got a busy, successful system. This means that when there is a disruption, it ripples across the network very rapidly, and it's those challenges which we're addressing through this unprecedented investment in our system. And this new investment is focused on the basics, making sure the trains run on time and punctually.
But the best measure of how your policy has failed is that Labour's policy of nationalising is popular, even with Tories.
Well, I don't think people really, when given the stark choice of going back to the bad old days of British Rail, would really think Labour's policy holds water. I don't think anybody seriously believes that reintegrating ownership under a monolithic public centre public sector entities such as the Old British Rail is really the way forward. You really need to throw your mind back to the kind of rail experience which people were having in the 70s and 80s, and then compare it to what you're seeing today, and really it's no contest.
Now, the big issue that's tearing your government apart is our future customs relationship with the rest of the EU. You'll be one of those people who would be urging the Prime Minister to do what the majority of parliamentarians want, which is for us to remain in the customs union.
Well, what the Prime Minister has set out is two paths towards a near frictionless trading relationship
do you have confidence in those paths?
EU
but do you
partners,
have personally,
and at the same time,
personally, do you have confidence in those two paths?
And at the same time, an ability to strike trade deals around the world. And they're, on the one hand, a customs partnership, and on the other hand, a streamlined customs arrangement. And she wants to have serious discussions with the European Commission, with Michel Barnier.
Which one of those should she go to?
About
which one should,
how they can work in practice on the ground.
Which one should she adopt? She can't adopt both. Which one should she adopt?
The negotiations are underway, and they are pursuing a dual-track strategy to see which one can deliver those important benefits of a meaningful...
Well, no, the government next week has to choose one of those paths. Which path should your cabinet colleagues choose?
It's not for me to preempt cabinet discussions or to force the PM's hand if I were able to. She and David Davis and the cabinet will determine which path makes best sense for the British people so that we can make a success of Brexit.
Come on, you've been thinking about these things for years. What's the right answer?
Well, the answer is we need an arrangement that maximises our ability to continue to trade in a near frictionless manner with our EU partners, whilst maintaining a meaningfully independent trade policy with third countries around the world.
Gosh, well, there we are. And a master of non-answer there from Joe Johnson. Please hurry back.
One of the issues at the heart of the Windrush scandal is what information is presented to ministers and what is dealt with by officials. Lord Kerslake was head of the Home Civil Service between 2012 and 2015, and I'm delighted to say joins me now. Lord Kerslake, thank you for being with us. In your mind, is it conceivable that either this Home Secretary or the last Home Secretary were unaware of those targets around illegal immigrants?
Well, let's put it this way. I find it very surprising. Now, there could be one memo, the one that she says she hasn't seen, that went into her office but didn't get into her box. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of emails and memos that go into the private office. What I find very surprising is that there wasn't some briefing to the Minister when she went before the Select Committee, or indeed other committees. So I think the question she's going to be asked tomorrow is not, were you aware of this particular memo, but were you briefed at any point on the issue of deportations and targets?
Yeah, I mean, in that memo it says, it adds a supplementary point about progress has been made on a path towards the 10% increase in performance on enforced returns, which we promised the Home Secretary earlier this year. Now, when you hear something like that, do you take it to mean that an official briefed the Home Secretary directly?
Well, if you say you promised it to the Home Secretary, then it follows that some kind of information must have gone either to the Home Secretary or one of her special advisors. And as I say, even if it wasn't done in that way, you would never put a minister in front of a select committee without properly briefing him on the issues.
Where then does responsibility lie? I mean, we do seem to be through the looking glass in so much of politics these days. Ministers used to resign for quite a lot less, by my reckoning. But we do see an awful lot of the buck being passed to those officials. I mean, do you think unfairly?
I think so, actually. I am concerned about this. There's been much less of the noises off that there were when I was head of the Civil Service, a really quite corrosive period, it has to be said. But I think when the chips are down, ministers have to take responsibility. It is their department, after all. Privately, they may well say to a civil servant, look, I'm not happy, this hasn't been handled well. But the whole deal, if you like, is that the minister is responsible. They take credit for the things that go well, and they take responsibility for the things that don't go well.
I mean, I just want to read you a tweet from the MP Julian Smith. He says, the UK civil service is helping to deliver Brexit. The quality of support and advice is world-class. Attacking individual civil servants is deeply unfair. That's now been retweeted by Theresa May's Chief of Staff, Gavin Barwell, who, if we believe accounts in the papers today, had something of a set-to with David Davis. I mean, have you ever known politicians and the civil service to be so at odds?
Oh, yes, there have been at odds in the past. And as I say, when I was head of the Civil Service, we had a very difficult time because what we were getting were what I called noises off, unofficial briefings about the Civil Service and their ability. And I think there's been less of that. But Julian is right there. You cannot be in a situation where civil servants are put to the sword, and they're not, and this is the key point, in a position to respond. They can't go to the Mail or the Telegraph or whatever and say,
They can leak memos, which is not... I'm not suggesting that's happened in this occasion, but they can leak memos. I mean, but again, on Brexit, the civil service does appear to be coming in for a huge amount of flack. I mean, do you think that the civil services remain?
Look, up until a few years ago, we have to remember that was substantive government policy. So all civil servants backed the then government policy of trying to stay in the European Union. We have seen a remarkable shift in recent years, and civil service have had to come to terms with that. But, and this is the point, they pride themselves on being professionals in doing the job of supporting the government of the day. So they will be wanting to deliver a good Brexit because that is the government's policy.
Still, at the same time, you know, when the House of Lords defeated the government and the Customs Union the week before last, every living former Cabinet Secretary voted against the government. Armstrong, Butler, Wilson, Turnbull, O'Donnell, Lord Kerr, who proposed the amendment, you know, who was joined in voting against the government by his two successors at the Foreign Office. It does seem like those who have moved on from the civil service are doing their very best to stymie the process of Brexit.
Well, I don't think so, because the votes against the Brexit bill are not, in a sense, saying Brexit cannot happen. They're saying if it happens, it has to be done in a way that doesn't damage the interests of this country. And as peers, as Lords, they're entitled to challenge government and ask them to think again on legislation. And I genuinely think that is what is happening here. I think the idea that there's some Trojan horse inside the civil service trying to undermine Brexit is a very bad place for any politician to try and get into at the moment.
Lord Kerslake, many thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, will be back in the House of Commons tomorrow to explain the government's policy with regards to immigration targets and what they're doing for the Windrush generation. Joining me now to discuss that and much more, the party's Deputy Chairman, James Cleverly. Mr Cleverly, very good morning to you. Can you just flesh out for me what you believe the criteria are for a minister to resign these days? Because, frankly, I'm a bit confused.
Well, you're trying to draw me on the situation with the Home Secretary. I think what she has said is absolutely fair and right, that there were communications within the department that she didn't see. She's apologised for that. But ultimately, what she's focusing on is making right this situation with the Windrush generation, making sure that their immigration status is regularised, and making sure that we do that whilst continuing to do the very important job of removing people who have no right to be here, often involved in criminal activities, and that is actually the right thing for her to be doing.
I mean, the question for some people is whether or not there has been a breach of the ministerial code. She says that she did not mislead the House intentionally, and therefore it is not. That will be looked at tomorrow. But, I mean, the HuffPost's Paul Waugh puts it better than me. There doesn't seem to be any consistency. If you mislead about pornography, you're sackable. If you endanger a British citizen in Iran, you're not. A lack of candour about trips to Israel gets you the bullet. Ruining the lives of the Windrush generation doesn't. I mean, isn't the truth that it's simply politically expedient to keep Amber Rudd where she is, for the time being at least?
Look, I've worked with Amber Rudd for a number of years. She's an incredibly diligent, focused and effective politician. The situation with the Windrush generation was decades in the making. It's a unique and it's a terrible situation, and we have apologised for the pain and suffering that those people have gone through. The job that the Home Secretary is now doing is making sure that we sort that problem out, whilst also doing the really important stuff of, you know, tackling knife crime, tackling modern slavery, tackling those injustices and problems that she is tasked to do.
The question is whether or not she's the best person to do so. I mean, she has apologised 5 times. She will issue what one presumes to be another grovelling apology tomorrow to the House. I mean, isn't her defence essentially that she's incompetent?
No.
I wasn't aware of targets. I accept that I should have been. I mean, it's incompetence.
I think Amber's being very tough on herself, which doesn't surprise me because she's a very professional person. She takes an awful lot of pride in doing the job well. The questions that were being asked of her in the Home Affairs Select Committee were about internal management metrics that had been discussed in a previous evidence session that morning, and were pieces of information which joined the many thousands of documents that float around inside the Home Office, to which many of whom, many of those documents are addressed to her. But actually, it wasn't seeking a decision. It wasn't seeking funding. It was an update.
I mean, it sounds very much to me like you're trying to pass the buck to the civil servants working within the Home Office. I mean, she says herself, I wasn't aware of targets. I accept that I should have been. You're saying, well, you know, there wasn't a decision to be made in all of this. There wasn't. It does sound as if Amber Rudd is not to blame, then who is for her not seeing this stuff?
No, I am absolutely not blaming the civil service. In fact, it's completely the opposite. So the memo was about internal management targets. It was about managers within the department discharging their duty professionally and giving a kind of a for-information update up the ministerial chain of command. Many of those documents are created. Not all of them are seen by ministers, and indeed, certainly not all of them are seen by secretaries of state. It is not passing blame at all. In fact, it's about saying that there's an awful lot of professional decision-making which is done at many levels within the department.
But again, to the point of Amber Rudd's competence or lack thereof, I mean, does she read anything? I mean, there have been a number of important documents that she hasn't seen. Take, for example, that Home Office report, which saw a link between cutting police numbers and violent crimes. I mean, she denied seeing that as well.
Oh, that was a leaked report that wasn't sent to her, so... you know, your criticism that she's not seeing documents that she hasn't been sent, I think, is a little bit harsh.
OK, if we take at face value that she didn't see the memo, and we have no reason to think otherwise, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that she didn't know about the targets. You know, there's this line in the memo itself. It says that progress has been made on a path towards the 10% increased performance on enforced returns, which we promised the Home Secretary earlier this year.
Yeah, yeah.
So she knew that it was a target?
No, there was a commitment to improve performance. That should be the aspiration of all government.
How do you know that you're going to get 10% better if you don't have a figure in the first place?
Well, you've got to remember, she was saying about what figures she was exposed to, what information had been sent to her. Within departments, there are key performance indicators. There are internal figures so that managers can manage the people in their charge.
What is a KPI if not a target?
It's an indicator. Basically, it's a measurement tool. And I know this sounds semantic, but it's important because the difference between what the Home Secretary said and what people are implying she said and criticising her for their interpretation of what was actually said, I think it's a subtle but a very significant difference.
I mean, it strikes me that perhaps it's getting a bit crowded on the head of that pin. But look, let's deal with the letter coming from the 200 MPs suggesting that the commitments made to the Windrush generation should be put into law. I mean, that's probably fair, isn't it, given that they probably don't have much reason to trust you right now?
Well, the really important thing is that the Home Secretary and the rest of the Home Office team are doing everything they can to regularise the status, to make sure that this can never happen again, to make sure that the people who have got to go through a process do so without being charged, and that we put it right. I think it is better to spend the time and effort delivering for the people who, through no fault of their own, have been disadvantaged by this circumstance, rather than preparing a bill. Because, frankly, that is... I understand the motivation of the people. I'm not questioning their motivation. I just think resources would be better spent dealing with this situation.
We have spoken time and again on this programme about the problems within Labour ranks, about anti-Semitism, and the Conservatives have talked about it as well. But isn't it the case that the Conservatives themselves have a problem with Islamophobia?
Well, there are individuals in all political parties, you know, these are big organisations that say and do things which are completely inappropriate. The question is how you deal with that. We have got
just on the simple point, I mean, do you concede that you have a problem with Islamophobia? I mean, Baroness Varsi said last week, I know within my own party there are now almost weekly occurrences of Islamophobic incidents and rhetoric. That sounds like a problem to me.
No, I don't believe. I don't agree with that as an assessment. What the point I was going to make is that where people have behaved inappropriately, our party, we have a respect pledge, we deal very quickly, we suspend people who have done something that we believe to be inappropriate, and if an investigation confirms that, then they are ejected from the party. I'm very proud of the fact that we take a tough line on people who behave inappropriately.
I mean, George Stokely, who is still standing for election in Cambridgeshire, no longer as a Conservative candidate, wrote that tweet saying he was sweating like a Jew in an attic. I mean, how do these people get past the vetting process?
Well, as I say, when individuals say and do things inappropriately, and that is self-evidently inappropriate, they are suspended. They are given an opportunity to explain themselves, and then if they fail to live up to the standards that we demand of them, they are ejected from the party. The reason he's still standing as a candidate is this came to light after the close of nominations. But we have made it clear. We deal with our problems. We are open and we are transparent about how we deal with those problems. And it would be nice if all political parties were able to do so in the way that we have.
I wonder if I might be able to encourage you to go a bit further than the Shadow Chancellor and give us an idea of how you think the Conservatives will do in the local elections this week. I mean, the Times Matt Charlie wrote this fantastic quote on Thursday. Back in February, asked a senior Tory if things were going to be bad for them May the 3rd. No, they said, much worse, I mean really effing bad, particularly in London. London is just a complete disaster. Really effing bad?
Not the phraseology, not quite the phraseology that I'm going to use on air.
Really bad.
Look, predicting election results is now, I think, a bit of a fool's errand because they are so difficult to call. We've seen the polling numbers. We know London is going to be a tough fight for us. We know that the Labour Party have been bragging about how they're going to get pretty much a clean sweep across London. We are fighting very, very hard. We have fielded a more complete slate of candidates than I think ever before, certainly in my time in politics. We're fighting hard for every seat, and we're fighting hard on that simple but compelling argument that we deliver better local services at less money than Labour councils. If people listen to that message, then I think we've got a good chance of doing well, but we recognise that 8 years into government, it's a really tough backdrop.
And I have to just bring up this picture that we happen to have. This is fantastic. You and Sully. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but it looks like you've got his vote at the very least. Mr. Cleverly, many thanks for being with us.
Thank you.